Greetings, everyone. You are listening to Through Time and Clays. I'm Ilari.
And I'm Albert.
And I'm June.
And welcome to a brand new series, Paleoart Beyond the Canvas, a series where we take a deeper look into paleoart, what it is, how to make it, and what exactly it means to be a paleoartist. My name is Ilari. I'm a paleontology student and paleoartist from the country of Finland, world famous for its total lack of a fossil record. I'm currently working on a thesis on fossil birds of the Pleistocene. As for my work as a paleoartist, I have worked as an illustrator as well as a science writer for a couple of magazines. I've done a few exhibits, actually, and I'll probably do any of those three things again. I specialize mostly in paleoart and wildlife illustration, mostly of birds. I've had a deep fascination with both modern and extinct wildlife for a good while, as well as a deep fascination for both wildlife art and paleoart, which this series will be about. And on the next slide, we can see a preview on what the series is going to be. On this episode, we will be looking at paleoart as a whole from a definitive and historic perspective. We'll try to look at what paleoart truly is, if art can even be defined, and we'll look at what entails paleoart in terms of artists who have made it and its history, as well as bits of paleoart appearing on television screens and the big screen. This series intends to cover paleoart as an artistic medium and a way to express scientific thinking. This is not a drawing course, even though some of this might appear drawing course-like. Nor is this a how-to series for drawing dinosaurs. I'm not qualified to do that kind of series, and in fact there are pretty good resources to do so. Art as a field is highly subjective, and this series is going to cover paleoart from a relatively objective point of view, and of course the views represented in this series represent the views of the host, who seems to be myself. And we also have a brief word to say on non-avian dinosaurs. Now, dinosaurs are popular, goes without saying, but it should be given attention here because dinosaur popularity is seen when people talk about paleoart and paleontology as a whole. It's easy to get the entire paleoart community hog wild when a new piece of dinosaur media or a new genus of dinosaur is described. This series isn't particularly focused on dinosaurs. We try to keep our focus on other animals, especially in the Cenozoic, because these animals are familiar. It's easy to read their anatomy without reading a bajillion papers on dinosaur or anatomy, and a lot of them are simply not well known, so it's interesting to cover these lesser known animals from a paleontological or reconstruction view. Dinosaurs are still popular, and people have made a lot of artwork from these. So you will occasionally see dinosaurs, but not particularly often outside of perhaps this episode. The role of dinosaurs in paleontology can, especially Tyrannosaurus, can be viewed as a bouncer to a nightclub, as one of my colleagues describes it. It's there at the doorway of the paleontology club, but few people go deep inside it because they are stuck in the front looking at this awe-inspiring, almost monstrous bouncer. In very basic terms, paleoart can be defined as the artistic representation of extinct life using reconstructions based on scientific data. A few of you might even agree with me on that. But I'd like to add a little extra definition. If a taxon is extinct, artwork depicting said taxon, in my view, is automatically paleoart because extinction is final. Something that's dead cannot be truly brought to life again, and we will always have an incomplete understanding, even if we have a photography or even film footage of said animal, like this thylacine. The thylacine is interesting because it looks a lot like a dog. Its anatomy is remarkably dog-like. But when you look at footage of a thylacine and you get an image of thylacines, there is always something off about it because it's a marsupial. It moves like a marsupial and acts a bit like a marsupial. It even has that marsupial attitude to it, where it's kind of off-putting to some. But a lot of people will illustrate it and view it as dog-like because it superficially resembles a dog. To add to this, just limiting paleoart to fossils can be problematic because the definition of what a fossil isn't perfect. Because there's a blurry line there between subfossil and fossil, between historic and truly prehistoric. Would dodos and moas and thylacines and stellar sea cows and gastric brooding frogs count as paleoart if they are represented scientifically in a piece of illustration? I would say that they do, because none of us will ever see a live one ever again. Now, if we move on to more practical definitions, we could say that paleoart is part scientific illustration and part wildlife art. Why a combination of just these two? Well, when you're doing paleoart, you are depicting wildlife, extinct wildlife, but it's wildlife nonetheless, in the natural habitat, as you do if you're doing a piece of wildlife art. But you are also depicting a scientific concept. You're describing and illustrating an idea, which is what you do in scientific illustration. Both of these, all of these, are deeply based in scientific data, which serves as the basis of each piece of art, be that contemporary wildlife, scientific concepts, paleontology, or any in-between of these. As for style, usually, not always, but usually, paleoart emulates wildlife art, or as it does often today, wildlife photography, because wildlife photography is the normal way of seeing a wild animal of any kind on the internet. There are stylistic differences between wildlife art and wildlife photography, but we'll cover that later in the series. There is a difference, and it's not as small as you'd think. But would you say there's anything to add to this?
I think it's a pretty good overview of what people consider paleo art to be. And yeah, you kind of hit on some of the complications because there is what is paleo, like how long ago did something die for a depiction of it to count as paleo art, and also what is art, I guess. And then when you put the two together, like how scientifically grounded should it be? I feel like that's something that can often be contentious in discussions about this subject. But I do think this is a pretty reasonable and appropriately broad scope that you have outlined here.
I like the attention to the fact of making an organism extinct as your baseline for paleo art. Because if you just make paleo art to be prehistoric life, there really isn't a date in deep time where prehistory ends and recorded history begins, if you really think about it. And so I think it's fair to have the extinct marker be the cutoff point.
Extinction is, I feel, a very simple and easy to understand line, because you can easily tell when something is extinct or isn't extinct, at least compared to what is and isn't a fossil or a subfossil. There's also the added bonus that a couple decades' time, a lot of wildlife art pieces will be considered paleo art. I don't know if that's a good thing, but still. Now, moving on to more stylistic definitions of what isn't paleo art. Many kinds of paleontological artworks can be called paleo art. We have life reconstructions, like this Charles Knight painting of a Triceratops, which is a piece of paleo art. Well, duh. It's basically what paleo art is at its core. You are reconstructing a fossil animal based on the science you have at the time you're making it to be as accurate and alive as possible. but there are wider definitions to that. How about skeletal reconstructions, anatomical works, or anything like that? I'd say that counts as paleoart because when fossils come out of the ground, they don't exactly come with instruction books how to put the bones together and how the animal was like in life. If you need rigorous anatomical research and data to put together the skeleton or the musculature of an animal, and that requires a different kind of artistic talent compared to life reconstructions, but I'd consider that to be paleoart by definition because you're putting something together, quote-unquote, to life. That applies to mounts, which are kind of similar because you also need to consider the anatomy and how the skeleton is put together, but unlike skeletals, which are usually two-dimensional, you also need to consider how a mount is put together, how it stands on itself. That requires engineering knowledge, an artistic knowledge, and just general knowledge of sculpture. You need to know how it's going to carry itself to be able to stand up on itself, but also effective at communicating to people that this is the kind of animal you are looking at. On the same way, you have sculptures like this spectacular sculpture of a Tyrannosaurus by Blue Rhino Studios about to chomp on a child, it seems. While some people might say that sculpture is 2D art, but in 3 dimensions, are kind of right, but also very wrong, because a sculpture is a medium on its own, because you also need to consider things like how the structure is going to carry itself, like in a mount. How is the pose going to look like in all 3 dimensions? How do you make it effective and expressive, and how do you make it communicate to the audience itself? And where do you stand it? How do you pose it? How is it going to carry itself? Paleoart also comes in a myriad of created forms. You can go for a stylized works compared to something that's deeply grounded in reality, like this Tyrannosaurus. Or you can take these images, take these sculptures, and set them in motion. As a filmmaker, this requires animation, and animation, when done right, it represents the ultimate knowledge of anatomy and movement, as well as expression and acting. And because you are basically creating a living being out of nothing, paper or a 3D model, and then you put it together and it's something wonderful, like with the Forgotten Bloodlines documentary that's still in production. Or how about writing? Well, if you are doing writing on an animal, you need to know how the animal is, how it senses its environment, what it looks like, what kind of mind's eye would it have, what kind of world did it live in, what kind of behavior do the animals do, and how do you put this together in such a way that it makes for a compelling story. And Raptor Red is a great example of this, because Bob Backer put it all together to make a pretty good book. But there can't be more, right? There can't be more kinds of creative expressions of paleo. Well, like, say, video games. Can video games be paleo art? Oh, yes. Prehistoric Kingdom, which is a zoo simulator, it essentially has deep paleontological background in it, and all of the animals shown in it are essentially very accurate and rigorous reconstructions that are then animated, which effectively it combines 2 very rigorous forms of paleoart together, and then you need to code it. You need to know how an animal's going to act, how it's going to behave, how it's going to carry itself, how it's going to interact with other animals and you, the player, if you have a player, which isn't a Prehistoric Kingdom, and you put all of that together. But, I mean, yeah, video games make sense. We've seen dinosaurs in video games for a long time, but there can't be anything else to it. There can't be, like, music, Pally. What? That would be silly, right? Well, you've proven me wrong. This person, if you are not familiar, is known as Professor Flint, who is a Scottish-Australian paleontologist, bit of a mouthful, and who has done basically paleontological songs, technically towards children, but anybody, in my view, can enjoy the songs that he's making. And why would they be considered paleoart? Well, they are deeply based in what the scientists have told Professor Flint what these animals were like, and thus the songs are based on the knowledge we have of the animals featured in the songs at the time of making the songs. Bit of a sentence, but basically he uses his paleo reconstructions as inspiration for his songs, and as such he has actually updated a few of his songs in his more recent albums. For example, he previously mentioned that Procoptodon hopped about with other kinds of kangaroos, but then he did a whole new song just for Procoptodon itself, mentioning how Procoptodon is weird because it's a walking kangaroo. Do you have anything to add?
I think it's definitely good to appreciate how many different forms paleoart can take, and certainly people who have followed the show for a long time know that I definitely have an interest in following musical tributes to paleoart. In fact, we probably mentioned Professor Flint at some point on the show before. There are all kinds of ways in which people can be creative, and paleontology can be a basis or an inspiration for any of those forms of creativity.
Lastly, I'd like to mention a very special kind of art form that's surprisingly similar to paleoart in many ways, which is taxidermy. The title of this slide is a bit strange, but let me explain. Taxidermists, as they are working, are bringing dead individual animals to life in a way, in almost a literal sense actually, but look at this diorama. This is actually an archive image of a gorilla diorama in the American Natural History Museum in New York. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate this image. It features a gorilla standing up and showing off in a dominance display. Someone had to go there and actually shoot that gorilla, which is an unfortunate truth and historical fact, but we just need to live with it. But also look at what's surrounding the gorilla. It's surrounded by these grand paintings of its habitat in the Congo. Someone painted that based on data given by fieldwork, and then someone put it in the lianas and the foliage, and someone had to study the gorilla, make the mold in which you put the skin on, and pose it in such a way that it's lifelike. Basically, they reconstructed the living environment of this gorilla. You can come to the conclusion that taxidermy, especially this kind of classic taxidermy that you see in these grand natural history museums, really is an art form, and it truly is, even though it's an unappreciated art form in my view. And what is the most deepest connection between paleoart and taxidermy is that ultimately both are based in scientific observations of the natural world. Now we need to ask the big questions. The hardest question, which is why? It's always the toughest question. Why? Why paleoart? Why bother making paleoart? Well, going on a sentimental, philosophical direction, paleoart is ultimately about exploring and appreciating planet Earth's deep time and ancient life, which is something that is genuinely a new idea. It was revolutionary at the time when this was conceived, and this gives us a new window to appreciate the past and learn about our present. There's also the aspect of exploring nature and seeing the nature of prehistory as a living, thriving ecosystem, not just a few dusty bones in a cupboard or some jagged, roughed up, eroded skeletons in the Badlands somewhere. There's also the aspect of paleoart where we see truly wild places. Wild places are disappearing rapidly thanks to humanity, and a lot of us don't really know what a truly wild place without human encroachment actually looks like. Paleoart is a key way to show what kind of world without humans was. There's also the aspect that if you want to know the living world, you also need to know the past, and if you want to know the past, you must appreciate the living. All living things have a prehistory, and prehistory helps us learn the living animals alive today. It's also a way to see other worlds, different stories, different lives. It's to broaden your horizons and see the world we live in today in a different light. And lastly, wildlife, be it modern or extinct, is just so freaking cool. but there are also practical sides. In a practical sense, paleoart is the only real PR paleontology ever gets. Scientists write a paper on a major discovery. What do people see? It's a piece of paleoart, or a piece of illustration, or a piece of the skeleton, or maybe even a fossil mound. They're all pieces of paleoart, except pieces of actual specimens, because that's technically e-photography. There's also a deep learning process in paleoart. Both artists and scientists learn more deeply about the creatures or plants they're depicting as someone is doing a piece of paleoart. An artist might ask questions the scientists never would have guessed, and the scientists will ask the artist questions they would have never have thought of before. And in all honesty, the public loves paleoart. A lot of people like looking at images of dinosaurs and mammoths or therapsids or pterosaurs, and it's all that they're going to see on the internet. It's also the only way to effectively engage with the public on these topics, unfortunately. So paleoart really does matter. As said before, it's the only PR in paleontology, effectively, outside of a few pop culture phenomena like Jurassic Park. Now, because of this, paleoart is extremely important to get people interested in science and interested in paleontology. And because of this communicative nature of paleoart, the artwork matters. What kind of pieces are you doing? The accuracy matters. You need to present to the people what we know. The quality of the art matters. You need to make it as good as you can to make it more appealing to people. The research you make matters because it directly affects how accurate you make your art piece. And you also need to make your art effective, because if you make your art effective, it makes it more clear to people what you're trying to say with your paleoart. What are you communicating with this illustration without making them read? Because reading is the last thing the general public tends to do. I have experience of this. I've worked in museums. Now that this definition is out of the way, we can move on to look at paleoart history. Now, the history of paleoart, as we know it, spans more than 200 years because people have really been reconstructing fossil animals as long as they've been digging them out of the ground. But there is something to be noted here. A lot of the time when paleoart enthusiasts or scientists talk about the history of paleoart, what they are actually doing is showing the history of dinosaur research from the medium of paleoart, because people like dinosaurs. It's kind of easy to show how much we have changed from the lumbering mountain blob animals to these larger-than-life super animals that we have today. But we also need to keep in mind that people have not just been illustrating dinosaurs. Fossil mammals, for example, have been very popular, both with scientists and with paleoartists. And we also need to look at them. It should also be noted that paleoart is a diverse field, and we are going to go through a bunch of artists in the next few slides, but we cannot include everyone. If we did, we'd be still talking about it next year. There's also a fun little quirk about the history of paleoart, which is that paleoart as a term referring to these reconstructions is relatively new. Previously, the pieces that would be now called paleoart were called restorations, reconstructions, or just simply illustrations. Originally, the term paleoart was coined for Paleolithic artwork done by Paleolithic people.
Oh, yes. What's actually really fascinating is that you don't really see the word paleoart used for ancient art in more modern coverage of the subject anymore, probably because of this connotation. At most, you'll have it referred to as just cave art or rock art, even just prehistoric art, or even primitive art. But yeah, paleoart is a term for Paleolithic pieces. I have not come across that in work from like the past couple of decades or so.
As we are covering historic paleoart, we also need to cover the crystal palace dinosaur in the room. Which is to politely ask viewers, or just people in general, to respect the classes. because the norm in paleoart discussion and paleontological communities is to look at old paleoart, point at it, and have a good laugh, because it's just so funny to look at how wrong people were back in the 1800s or the 1900s when they didn't have the power of knowing everything we do today. But I would argue that there's a lot to enjoy in paleoart, both old and new, because many paleoartists of old were actually very good at what they were doing. You really shouldn't mock paleoart that's old because it's old. What you should do is admire the skill of artists of old and not just laughing at their mistakes. Pointing at inaccuracies and nitpicking about of them in pieces of old paleoart doesn't make you a better paleoartist. And it's not to say that we aren't free of these mistakes. The present day isn't exactly free of old paleoart. You could probably find examples if you look at children's books. Arguably, old paleoart can still be enjoyed today, and people back in the olden day, he still got some things right. In fact, sometimes the most interesting part about a piece of paleoart isn't what people get wrong, but what they get right, all with the power of very intricate research, deep knowledge of animal anatomy, and well-informed scientific speculation. Take a look at these two Allosauruses, for example. They were both done by the same artist, famed paleoartist Charles R. Knight. Look at the one on the left there. It's basically proportionally accurate. It's standing level to the ground with its tail held up. The forelimbs are short but muscular with 3 fingers, and the shape of the head is actually really good, and it's using an S-shaped neck to pull pieces of flesh out of pieces of sauropod vertebrae in a surprisingly bird-like pose that's really natural looking at it today. There are anatomical inaccuracies, of course, because the anatomy of this Allosaurus was probably based on something like a monitor lizard or an alligator as opposed to a bird like we do it today, but it's still pretty close to what you'd see today. In fact, you could probably see Allosaurus painted today doing the same behavior. Now, looking at the piece on the right, it's actually a later piece. Charles R. Knight's dinosaur paintings have a strange habit of degrading over time, probably thanks to work of dinosaur paleontologists at the time, but it's essentially doing the same behavior. And it should be noted, these two pieces are effectively communicating the same thing. It's an Allosaurus, it's a large predatory dinosaur that feeds on sauropod meat, and it's a very awe-inspiring animal. And we can bask in the majesty of both of these pieces, despite their minor historic inaccuracies. Now, to delve deeper into paleoart history, we can start by looking at some of the true classics. On the left, you can see what might be one of the first life reconstruction pieces of paleoart called Duria Antiquor, done by Henri de la Beche. This piece of art depicts a more ancient Dorset based on fossils collected from the Jurassic coast by none other than Mary Anning. In fact, this piece was sold as prints, as lithographs, to raise money for Mary Anning, who was suffering from major illnesses at the time. And it depicts this rich diversity of life known from Lyme regions, including ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, marine crocodiles, and all kinds of fish living in a weird, primordial, unrecognizable landscape that will today be known as Great Britain. On the right there, you can see two pieces of a rather obscure fossil animal called Anoplotherium. These two drawings were made by Georges Cuvier, who was to be known as one of the founding fathers of paleontology as we know it, and also one of the first scholars to suggest the possibility of extinction. These are significant because these two pieces are effectively reconstructions. The piece above is a line drawing of an Anoplotherium fossil, a partial skeleton, and including a very well-preserved skull that, if I remember correctly, was discovered in a phosphate mine near Paris. And the drawing below is a skeletal reconstruction, effectively, of a live Anoplotherium. Moving on to some of the great classics, we have none other than Charles R. Knight. I mean, Charles R. Knight is one of the most celebrated and recognized paleoartists of all time, and you can see why. Even though the pieces are not fully accurate as he would consider them today, what they all have is this intricate, deep, professional knowledge of animal anatomy, animal appearance, what Charles Knight called animal psychology, which would be the inner mindscape of an animal. But also, these are just great pieces of art as a whole. There's a reason why they're still popular today, even though they're not accurate. Like these hadrosaurs on the left, for example, they are in an inaccurate pose, and they are next to a pond where they were presumed to dwell and feed on aquatic plants at the time. But at the same time, what we see is a really good understanding of form and of mood and of motion. The animals in the images appear alive, full of vitality. They are ready to live and breathe in these canvases, despite their inaccuracies, which honestly is limited to dinosaurs, in my opinion, because his Cenozoic pieces, his mammals, his birds, are really, really good even today. Like you can see with the Smilodon and Teratolis on the right. Effectively, modern artists can draw them the exact same way, and they'd be about as accurate, which just speaks to the degree in which Charles R. Knight familiarized himself with his subjects and how much research he did, both of modern animals and of extinct animals. Following Charles R. Knight, we have Czech artist Zdeněk Burian, who is not as well known as Charles R. Knight, but that doesn't make him any less iconic in terms of paleoart history, because he was effectively the grandmaster of paleoart in Europe, whereas Charles R. Knight was the grandmaster of paleoart in the US. And you can see that in his artworks, which are just full of moodiness and really interesting lighting and really beautiful motion. You can see the moodiness in his two woolly rhinos on the right and this his middle iguanodon, which appears to be standing on the bones of his comrades. This iguanodon reconstruction is also significant because it was effectively the iguanodon for a good while, until about Greg Paul times, when the kangaroo pose was fully ditched in favor of a modern horizontal vertebral column. I should also note this Megaloceros for not only just being magnificent, but it's also engaging in really interesting movement. It's leaping. It's fully panicking and fleeing from these wolves. And seeing Megaloceros running at all is a surprisingly rare sight in modern paleoart, even though we know from fossil evidence that a Megaloceros was probably a pretty fast animal, and it did live in wide open spaces when it could. So it's a really unique piece of paleoart. Now, there is a classic who is a bit more obscure than Burian or Knight. That would be Bruce Horsfall, who is best known for doing a whole bunch of reconstructions about fossil mammals. These are genuinely pretty good reconstructions, which showcase a good knowledge of animal anatomy. Bruce Horsfall was a very competent wildlife artist, which is why he was hired to do all these reconstructions. And it should be pointed out that while he isn't particularly well known, his artwork really is. Horsfall might not be as technically competent as Charles R. Knight, but these pieces might be occasionally misidentified as art pieces done by Charles Knight, which is really saying something about Bruce Horsfall. Moving on to another side of the globe, we come to the weird world of Soviet paleoart. Paleoart and paleontological research done in the Soviet Union isn't particularly well known to us people in the West for some reason. And what I'm showing here are examples from two Soviet paleoartists. On the left, we have 3 pieces from Vasily Vatagin, which feature a family of Elasmotherium, an Inostrancevia stalking a Scutosaurus, and a sculpture of walruses. On the right, we have Konstantin Fyorov with Saurolophus and Paraceratherium, which was known as either Belushitherium or Indricotherium at the time of making the painting. Soviet paleoart is this really not well-known and deeply fascinating piece of paleoart history because it's very obscure, but from what we do see is a really intriguing amount of deeply skilled, artistically heavily inclined artists who were not afraid to stylize and even play with the artwork that they were doing. Paleontologists in the Soviet Union and modern Russia have long thought that perhaps Elasmotherium didn't have a proper horn on its head, that it was simply a bump on the head. This is a relatively modern idea in the West, which was popularized by a certain article. I can't remember the authors of that paper off the top of my head, but this piece was made in around the 40s or 50s, which if I remember right, which is to say, yeah, in some ways these guys really knew what they were doing, and these are just stunning artworks as a whole. Do you two have anything to say about Soviet paleoart?
I certainly wish it was more widely known, and obviously thanks to the Zoe Lascan's Paleoart book, I would hope that more and more of it is reaching wider Western audiences. Just knows there's probably like the coverage in that book was probably the tip of the iceberg for what has been produced by the former state. I quite like the moodiness and the style of some of these pieces. There's almost fanciful approach to some of them as well that I think is really appealing. What about you, Al?
Yeah, they're definitely very atmospheric, and you're right. These are quite obscure works. I would say, I'm someone who is reasonably interested in paleoart, and I was not familiar with most of these works or artists.
Yeah, I do agree about the moodiness. I especially love the moodiness on these Saurolophus pieces with this super bright sunset, and there's this kind of playfulness present with the coloration in the Indricotherium piece. And I think there's also a bit of the playfulness with the stalking Inostrancevia in the upper left. It looks like a tiger about to pounce on its prey. Now, moving on from Soviet paleoart, we can look at early ways of stylization, looking at how more quote-unquote cartoonish or stylized ways of doing paleoart, which includes one of the greats, that being Maurice Wilson, who did these impeccable, beautiful watercolor pieces of all kinds of prehistoric animals. What he was especially skilled at was painting birds. We can see this forest raccoon as being delightfully vulturey and really, really fluffy. I really like how fluffy he is. I've also decided to show a piece of these two plesiosaurs crawling onto land and like seals, which is something people thought plesiosaurs could do at the time. Now we know that they couldn't. They'd probably just beach themselves and die like whales do. But if you look at a plesiosaur and you're not sure what the anatomy of the structure was, this would be a perfectly reasonable assumption that they could do. We just now know that they couldn't, which is to say that ideas that we think are true and accurate today might change completely, and we will find ourselves laughing at ourselves for how wrong we are. On the right there, we see a Pteranodon by William Skeel. I'm going to say that's how you pronounce it, Skeel or Scheel. who was this American illustrator and artist who did a whole volume of prehistoric animals. And I chose this pteranodon because it's really interesting how he drew it. It's almost skeletal or gargoylish in a way. It's this draconic goblin creature from a children's story book that's about to kidnap the princess or something. I really like the look of that pteranodon, to be honest. Do you have anything to add about Maurice Wilson or William Skeel?
Well, what's really great about Maurice Wilson is that he's also a modern wildlife artist. He had, in the past made, various illustrations for many different books. And so I can certainly only imagine that he used that knowledge to inform his paleo art and make it, in many ways, more realistic than many other artists of the time were doing. And William Scheel, I mean, he's definitely lesser known, but I really like his approach to stylization. His animals are unique, I think, in paleo art in this aspect. The sort of storybook approach to illustrating them that I think is really underrated.
Now, moving on from classic stylization, we are moving on to some of the great paleo artists of the 50s and the 60s, and chief among them, in my opinion, would be J. Maternes, who again is a wildlife artist and an expert on animal anatomy. He, at a certain point of his career, he was actually asked to paint a bunch of murals for the Smithsonian Institute to illustrate the evolution of life throughout the Cenozoic, like this one depicting an early Eocene forest. Now, what I'm going to say is, if you want to, pause the video and just look at this piece. Look at how much detail there is. Look at how many animals there are. Or can you figure out how many animals there are in this image? You can see how much he fit in there, but the image isn't cluttered, and it's communicating what kind of world these animals were living in and what kinds of animals were living in early Eocene in North America. And what's more, each animal has impeccably done an anatomy and appearance. All of them appear alive, and they are essentially accurate. Again, if you are willing to do so, pause the video and just bask in the glory of this image. Moving on from J. Maternes, we have another great from the 50s and 60s, that being Rudolf Zallinger. Now, Rudolf Zallinger is best known in the paleontology community for doing a grand mural for the Yale Peabody Museum called The Age of Reptiles, which is really well known, really popular. However, I chose not to include that particular image in here because there is a piece that he did that's even more well known, which is this one, The March of Progress, depicting human evolution. And it's a really beautifully made illustration of the diversity of fossil hominins, but it's also one of the most misinterpreted pieces of scientific illustration I can think of, because human evolution, or any evolution really, isn't a straight line from lesser things to greater things, as this image would seem to illustrate. And this particular view of this piece of art has been copied and parodied and referenced to death at this point, which is really showing how effective this image is at showing people or the quote-unquote process of human evolution, even though people heavily misinterpreted this, even though there's a timeline on the top there, you can which is listing the different taxa and saying, hey, human evolution isn't a straight line from ape to man, and evolution isn't a progress. Stop interpreting it as such. But people do it anyway because nobody reads the labels. And something about the pervasiveness of this image of human evolution can be told with a very strange example, that being in the series Phineas and Ferb, There's an episode where Dr. Doofenshmirtz has his new devious device, which is a devolution ray that devolves a person into the first form of human evolution, Pliopithecus. What is the first animal on this march of progress? Pliopithecus. Which is, again, this is an image that has spoken 1,000 words and hasn't been forgotten by the general public, for better and for worse. Mm-hmm. Moving on from Rudolf Zallinger, we have another great paleoartist, this time from the 70s, this being Eli Kish. Personally, I'm not particularly familiar with Eli Kish's artwork, but looking at these images as an example, she has done incredible work. These art pieces are really pretty to look at. They have very delightful lighting and shadow. They are very moody. They all have a kind of atmosphere about them. With this Stiggy Moloch on the left, you can see this warm, sunny glow of a sunrise or a sunset as it's strolling through a forest, and you can just hear the crunkling on the leaf litter and the rustle of leaves as it moves through the forest. And on the right, you see this absolutely beautifully haunting image of a sauropod taking a stroll. And while these paleoart pieces, for today's standards, are painfully shrink-wrapped, they still stand the test of time as beautiful and grand pieces of paleoart. It should also be noted that Eli Kish is kind of a pioneer as one of the first women in the field of paleoart.
One thing that I definitely recall about Eli Kish is that when she was doing many of these pieces like you've shown here, primarily for a large project called The Dinosaurs of North America, she was under the supervision of paleontologist Dale Russell, who some of you might be familiar with for pioneering the dinosauroid model, a hypothetical reconstruction of a future descendant of one of the non-avian dinosaurs had the extinction event not occurred, and one of those organisms would have evolved into a sort of sapient human-like form. So essentially like a dinosaur person. But he had basically consulted for Eli Kish in producing these paintings. And I understand that plays a big role into why, for lack of a better word, they look so emaciated. But certainly her expertise in painting prehistoric animals goes well beyond this project. Before the massive renovation that went underway at the National Museum of Natural History for the Smithsonian, she painted a very large, almost Age of Reptiles-esque mural for the exhibit on prehistoric ocean life. It's like Life in the Ancient Seas, I believe the hall was called. And this massive mural spanned from the Devonian all the way into Cenozoic times. And it just, the attention to detail and the movement of the animals, as well as her mastery of lighting, certainly makes her one of the greats, in my opinion, in terms of artistic integrity and really getting a personality for paleoart pieces.
Now, moving on from Eli Kish to the dinosaur renaissance, we come to an obscure artist called Robert Bakker. Calling Robert Bakker obscure in the field of paleontology is a bit of a stretch, but what people don't tend to know is that Robert Bakker not only was a very prominent paleontologist, he was also a very prominent paleoartist, especially in his younger years. He still draws today, in his lecture as an example, but his artwork isn't as prevalent as it was today. And from the left, you can see this Allosaurus is rearing up and tearing itself into this very unfortunate crocodile. A lot of Bakker's paleoart pieces are like that. They are these hyper-dynamic, in-your-face pieces where dinosaurs are in all these crazy poses, and they're running, they're leaping, they're fighting, they're clashing, they're roaring, they're hopping, they're galloping and panting and bashing and all sorts of action, nonsense, wordy things. But look at the image on the right. That is a Deinonychus, and if you are familiar with this image, there's a good reason for that, because arguably this image is probably one of the most influential pieces of paleoart ever made. Because what it is that it's the starting gun of what was to be later known as the dinosaur renaissance, showing that these animals aren't just lumbering mounds of flesh, archaic, draconic beings of pea-sized brains that dwell in some misty primordial marsh. They were active, intelligent animals that were living interesting lives and were running and chasing and leaping, which is what this Deinonychus is doing, and what Deinonychus was suggested to be able to do in Ostrom's description of this animal. One cannot overstate the absolute impact Deinonychus had in the field of dinosaur paleontology, and it was all thanks to this image of it running by Robert Bakker, which is saying something. Moving on to other artists of the dinosaur renaissance, we have Gregory S. Paul. Greg Paul is today a relatively controversial figure due to his rather interesting takes on dinosaur or taxonomy, but especially in his earlier years, he was the poster child of illustrating the dinosaur renaissance. He illustrated dinosaurs moving and hunting and running like this Allosaurus is doing to this poor Stegosaurus. But he also did these dynamic poses of dinosaurs in herds, dinosaurs defending themselves, dinosaurs being very colorful, and they were roaring and they were doing very active things, which was a novelty at the time. And all of this was accentuated by Greg Paul's groundbreaking monograph, The Predatory Dinosaurs of the World. Mistakes being there, obviously. But he showed the people the dinosaur renaissance because it was a popular book. Alongside this, it should be noted that Greg Paul was something of a pioneer in terms of dinosaur anatomy. He was among the first paleoartists to actually study dinosaur skeletal anatomy, not just for making life reconstructions, but actually putting the skeleton together in a lifelike pose. He invented the modern dinosaur skeletal reconstruction, like you can see from the Brachiosaurus/Giraffa Titan. And while his artwork can be a bit dodgy, you could definitely say that he knew what he was doing when it came to dinosaur skeletal anatomy and many aspects of dinosaur muscular anatomy. Another great paleoartist of the dinosaur renaissance is Douglas Henderson, effectively one of the best paleoartists of all time. Many people will hold this opinion. I hold this opinion as well, and there's a good reason for this. What Douglas Henderson excels at is creating these grand pieces, artworks that feel larger than life, depicting dinosaurs as part of a grand landscape, and the animals themselves feel a part of this grandeur. Everything feels connected, and it's all accentuated with exquisite use of light and shadow, and of moodiness, and of perspective. A lot of his artworks effectively feel like grand landscape paintings with a couple of dinosaurs hidden in there that you need to find with a magnifying glass. But I chose these particular artworks because they are actually depicting dinosaurs you can see without using a magnifying glass. And they really are showing these grand animals, these grand events happening, like this rampaging horde of coelophysis in a Triassic forest, and you could just feel the heat of the sun, even in the shade of this forest, as they are trampling through the underbrush. And on the right, we see this dark, gloomy, almost somber image of a diplodocus being harassed by a trio of Allosaurus, which is just a spectacular sight to behold, as far as I'm concerned. And he does great artwork, is all I can say. He's just that good. Moving on from the dinosaur renaissance, let's do a brief foray into the world of Cenozoic paleoart. The people in this section don't really have a specific age. I just want to show a few people who great mammals. These are Peter Schouten and Peter Trussler. Let's just ignore the fact that the artwork from Peter Trussler includes a dinosaur.
So does the other one.
True, but the other one's a Cenozoic one.
Yep.
These are two paleoartists from Australia with the first name Peter. If I had a nickel every time there was an Australian paleoartist with the first name Peter, I'd have 3 nickels. Because there's a third one with the name of Peter Murray, who I couldn't include in this. But anyway, Peter Schouten, an example of his artwork is featured on the left, is very good at these pieces that feel very detailed and very lifelike. He's great at adding the essence of a living being into his artwork, and he does that by doing intricate detail with his brushes. He works with watercolor and gouache, I believe, and he has these intricately layered artworks that just feel like they pop and they bring the subject directly into your face. There's a kind of softness, there's a kind of living force to them that is not particularly easy to see in a lot of paleo, but which makes him really unique. And Peter Schouten is especially great, I think, with bird. That's because birds kind of need that approach of fine, soft detail, just layered on top of each other. Now, where Peter Trussler is also very intricate, but not in the way of Peter Schouten, where Peter Schouten does really intricate art pieces. Peter Trussler is a rigorous scientific paleoartist in every sense of the word, and none of his pieces include speculative material and are just deeply based in fact. This is a piece of paleoart that won a prize, I think, because it's effectively showing what the depositional environment was like in Dinosaur Cove. There's a dead dinosaur, a piece of dead fish there, a bunch of leaves here, and it's all getting covered with water. It's showing exactly what we can know from the field, which is very interesting and definitely a novel way to look at it. What do you have to say about these Australians?
Well, admittedly, I'm more familiar with Peter Schouten, and that's mainly through his art of living wildlife. He illustrated a number of books where he made a lot of really prolific illustrations of birds and lizards and mammals, and I mean his attention to detail in a lot of these pieces is remarkable. It's like on the edge of like almost photorealistic for some of these organisms, and of course when that goes into his paleo art, that's even more remarkable in my opinion. My introduction to him, of course, growing up was a book called
Gap in Nature, which showcases Holocene extinctions.
Yes, and every illustration in that book, well, for the most part, like every illustration in that book was scale, which was really impressive. Like you'd open the book and the pages, like this extinct gecko, that's how big it would have been in life. And it's remarkable that they were able to print it in that way. I also remember his Feathered Dinosaurs book, which was interesting, trying to use his knowledge of bird anatomy to reconstruct some of the dinosaurs. I think didn't work in the best way, in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Simply competent for sure.
I do have that book. The anatomy of most of the dinosaurs is a bit wonky, but they have the Peter Schouten's signature intricacy. So it's a weird balance between the two things.
Certainly. What about you, Al?
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat, I think, because I've definitely seen Peter Trussler's work before, but I'm also more familiar with Peter Skouten's work, and for very similar reasons, because of several books he illustrated. Specifically, yeah, A Gap in Nature, I think, might have been the first place where I really became familiar with his artwork, but also his artwork of like extant animals, not just extinct ones. He illustrated a book called Astonishing Animals, I think it was, which was a selection of like very obscure animals, essentially, mostly vertebrates for the most part, but all kinds of vertebrates. So there were mammals, but also fishes and non-avian reptiles and amphibians. And in that one, his skill as a wildlife artist really stands out because he's depicting all these very obscure species in very vivid and lifelike ways. And certainly his work on Cenozoic paleoart, like you said, is also similarly well done. And I also remember the one where he did the book where he did Mesozoic feathered dinosaurs, and yeah, I'm kind of with you there. Like there were definitely, you could definitely tell that he was less familiar with those animals, and I know in a review by a paleontologist, Darren did point out that there were quite a number of anatomical inaccuracies in those particular works. But nonetheless, yeah, I think both of these artists on the slide here are definitely excellent at their craft, and I have definitely enjoyed seeing many of their works.
Yeah, moving on to another star of Cenozoic Paleoart. Well, effectively the star. Yep. The star of Cenozoic Paleoart, which is Mauricio Anton, who is still working today and still doing these. I don't want to say masterpieces because I think that's overselling it, but just these incredibly lifelike, intricate renderings, both digital and traditional, of prehistoric mammals going about their business, especially of saber-toothed cats. He combines a deep understanding of both modern cats and these extinct cats and puts them together in these arguably most accurate, lifelike, wondrous, awe-inspiring reconstructions of fossil big cats that I've personally ever seen. I mean, to be fair, he is in the pipeline of doing paleoart where he actually makes scientific papers on the life appearance of these animals. So if a paleoartist is doing that, they're probably pretty good at their job, and Mauricio Anton definitely is good at his job. For example, just bask on the majesty of this Megantherion on the left here. Now, moving on to modern paleoart classics, we have a very special case known as John Sibbick. Why is John Sibbick a special case? Well, for the simple reason that for a good while he was the paleoartist. And when I say the, I mean it. When NHM or AMNH or other grand museums or books wanted dinosaur illustrations, he asked this guy. This piece specifically, I'm very familiar with. I don't remember which book it was where I saw it, but it's the John Sibbick piece I remember the best. It depicting an Allosaurus simply tearing itself into a very, I'm going to say disgruntled-looking Diplodocus. Like, he looks in pain, but it looks like he's only got like a little scratch on him. Like nothing too serious. So you can effectively say that for a period of time, John Sibbick was the paleoartist. As for the quality of his artworks, well, they're very good, but I grew a bit after the main John Sibbick era, so not as familiar with his works as I would like, but they're still pretty damn good for what they are. Moving on to the next example of a modern classic, we have have Mark Hallett, who was most active at the same time as John Sibbick, and there are some stylistic similarities between the two, but there was a difference. The main difference being that Mark Hallett was arguably more prevalent in mammal paleoart. This piece of art featuring a Triceratops skeleton and with a bunch of mammals just squabbling as the sun rises for the first time after the KPG extinction. This piece of art is basically the prelude to the popular image of the KPG aftermath. It's a bunch of little mammals crawling out of dinosaur bones and looking at the destroyed landscape, which I think was in a Phil Tippett animation at least.
Yep.
And you just see it in a lot of dinosaur books. We'll talk more of Phil Tippett later on, but the image presented here by Mark Hallett is very popular. Mark Hallett also deserves a special mention as the person who coined the term paleoart in reference to scientific reconstructions of extinct animals as living beings. So effectively, Mark Hallett invented the modern definition of the word paleoart, which is quite a big deal, I think. Now, another modern classic is probably a less well-known artist called John Gurchie, who is especially good, I think, in these grand, cinematic, awe-inspiring, larger-than-life pieces, like in this piece of Allosaurus is chasing a sauropod. Well, although, is it just me, or those sauropods are either really big, or the Allosauruses are really damn small? But this artwork by John Gurchie is actually one of the first pieces of grand paleo I remember seeing, and I remember it because it was on the cover of the VHS of National Geographic's Really Wild Animals episode on dinosaur was another creature feature, which I watched way too much as a child. Now, John Gurchie is also extremely prevalent in anthropological reconstructions, doing hominin paleoart, doing paleoart of early humans, and he's very good at it. What he does is that he makes these sculptures that he bases on the skulls of actual individuals, and he builds them up from the skull into effectively a personality, because all of his hominin reconstructions, especially the sculptures, they feel like people. They feel like actual human beings looking back at you and judging you, because that's apparently what people did back there. And he also who did this grand monographic book called Lost Anatomy, which is just a collection of these intricately made art pieces of fossil hominins. Do you have anything to add about John Gurchie?
Oh yeah, I really enjoy his hominin restorations, and he's one of the few that I believe has illustrated all the known species up to a certain point. He even once took some of his busts like this and kind of made like a morphing animation, starting with like Sahelanthropus and going into Homo sapiens, which is really cool and helps you show the change in anatomy and facial proportions over time. One of my favorite pieces from John Gurchie that I thankfully have as a poster is a mural that he did for, again, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History back in the old fossil hall before it was renovated. That was called, hilariously enough, the Tower of Time, because it was a huge vertical mural, and it started with Precambrian microbes on the bottom, and it ended with Homo sapiens and a view of the Earth and space at the very top. It just demonstrates his mastery of composition, I think, in being able to tell the story of life on Earth, and that looks visually appealing. It's absolutely remarkable. His detailing work is incredible, and his artwork is one of those pieces I think that often stands the test of time in terms of composition, lighting, and posing, and subject materials. I mean, there's some pieces of his that just blow me away. I really like one that he did with some hadrosaurs in like a very green forested setting. And if you were just kind of glancing at it, okay, that's cool, and then moving on, like that's all you would see. But in the back, there is this huge Tyrannosaurus that's the same green as the forest, just lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike at these hadrosaurs. And oh my gosh, like that, I always get chills looking at that, and I never get tired of it. He's definitely up there as one of my favorites for sure.
Absolutely. Moving on to yet another modern classic in terms of paleoart, we have a certain James Gurney. Now, if you are familiar with James Gurney, you can probably guess why he's featured here, but in case you don't, James Gurney was and is actually an illustrator who used to work extensively with National Geographic magazine, and he did these impeccable reconstructions of archaeological sites, but he always liked dinosaurs, and what he then did during the 90s was to write a certain novel called Dinotopia, and the pieces of dinosaurs and other prehistoric life that he did for that book are just magnificent. Take this. On the right, you can actually see one of the illustrations he did for Dinotopia depicting a skybax. Skybax in the Dinotopia books are both the riders of Quetzalcoatlus and the Quetzalcoatlus themselves, which are referred to as skybacks. The people who ride the skybacks are called skybax riders, and they have a special bond with each other, kind of like in How to Train Your Dragon. But what you see in these images is just magnificent. The lighting, the composition, and the everything just bask in the glory of this beautiful Quetzalcoatlus piece. Is pause the video if you like. Just look at it. Look at it. On the left is an illustration of Giganotosaurus, which, if I remember correctly, was one of the first scientific reconstructions of Giganotosaurus, and he was actually one of the first people to actually feature Giganotosaurus in the piece of media. In Dinotopia: A World Beneath, there is a Giganotosaurus character, and he got data on Giganotosaurus before the paper describing the animal was published, if I remember right, which is just awesome in general. And I really like the pose and the composition of this Giganotosaurus piece. It's charging forwards, and you just see the raw power and majesty of this great beast as it lunges towards something. I don't know what it's lunging towards, but you never question these things in Paleoart anyway. Now, I could say more about James Gurney. His prolificness as an artist. He actually has a YouTube channel where he showcases his process on his paintings. And to put it blunt, and he is one of the best artists at the moment. Just in general, he's that good. Now, moving on to the modern classics, to a more recent time. The 90s, which was over 30 years ago. I'm old. We have a certain David Krantz, who is an obscure artist, but if you don't know David Krantz, you might be familiar with the work he's done. David Krantz has worked as a concept artist for films since the 90s, and his work includes works such as, I don't know, Disney's Dinosaur Revolution, and Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal, as well as a bunch of Marvel films, but I don't care about them, so I'm moving on. What strikes me about David Krantz especially is the amount of character and dynamics he puts it into his pieces. He just makes everything alive and stylized and cartoonish, but not in a way that's very cartoonish. It just makes the dinosaurs feel like character, as lifelike living characters in the grand stage of life. He does these lovely dinosaur sculptures where you can see them roaring and posing or just resting peacefully, as this theropod is doing right here. There is an expressiveness to David Krentz's artwork that is present throughout everything he's done. And what he has brought to the table is his deep knowledge of both dinosaur anatomy but also character design. Another relatively obscure paleoartist during the 1990s is Michael Strepnik, who has done these really interesting, highly detailed, and really appealing dinosaur reconstructions. I'm especially a fan of this Dinocyrus, which was among the first artworks that we ever saw, or when we got the actual skeleton of the animal, which was really cool at the time. And it's a really interesting illustration of, we see the first time this humpbacked, hulking, really bizarre-looking Dinocyrus. I also, on the Tyrannosaurus piece on the left here, I also like the perspective, this fish-eye lens perspective, which is really cool. And we see a fluffy Tyrannosaurus chick, which is just really fun. But I'm not particularly familiar with Michael Strepnik's work, so I'm going to ask my co-hosts, what thoughts do you have on Michael Strepnik?
I'm mainly familiar with Michael Strepnik through National Geographic. That Tyrannosaur piece in particular is one I'm actually quite fond of. It's one of my favorites from him, just in terms of the kind of, I don't know if fisheye is the right word, kind of the warping image from like a downward perspective is really cool to see. He is certainly one that I have not seen much of his work in other media, and I think he certainly deserves a lot more attention if he hasn't gotten it. What about you, buddy?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, for a while, I think I listed Michael Strepnik as one of my favorite paleo artists because it stands out in a way, but not in a way that's super flashy or in your face. I mean, both of these pieces are really iconic, but like they feel really naturalistic, I would say. And interestingly, probably the most I've seen of his work in terms of quantity was in the book Dinosaur Odyssey by Scott Sampson, who is a paleontologist. The book is illustrated by Michael Strepnik, and he has these black and white illustrations at the start of every chapter, and those stood out to me quite a bit. Like they're certainly, not being in color, they're of course in a slightly different vibe from his usual work, but you can see like the attention to detail and the naturalistic depiction of the animals kind of shine through in those as well. He definitely deserves a place here in this episode.
He really does make these really intricate and visually highly appealing artworks that really do deserve more attention. But we do have to move on to another star of the 90s, being Raoul Martin. He stands out in Paleoart as someone who really has drawn a lot of really big pieces. He really does excel at drawing big, grand scenes. His best-known work, in my opinion, is of sauropods, and he is really good with them, and he knows how to sell the scale of these animals and the amount of just mass and size these guys have, which I really appreciate. It's really cool. Now, another star of the 90s paleoart scene is Louis Ray, who is a very interesting person in so many ways. He was among the first paleo artists, aside from Greg Paul, for example, to really put feathers in dinosaurs. But beyond that, he imagined dinosaurs as these hyperactive, colorful, just absolutely bizarre animals that were always up to some mischief. And a lot of his paleo really is like that. It's in your face, and it's weird. I'm a really big fan of his earlier work in particular because it was unique at the time, and he makes each animal unique visually, which is a really fun thing. We're all familiar with Louis Ray. Do you have any notes on Louis Ray?
Oh, Louis Ray. I definitely grew up with him. Um, what's really neat is that I read some of his interviews. He very much cares deeply about getting the accuracy of the animals correct, even with all of the flashiness of the coloration that many have seen as perhaps too wild. Um, like there was a series of playing cards called Weird and Wild Creatures that some of you may remember, where they featured. It was essentially like a Pokemon type game. You have animals of different clades battling each other out, and they all have stats and rankings and that sort of thing. Well, they had a prehistoric subset of the cards that you can get, and one of the common features of the creatures cards is that the animals are, as you describe, Ilari, in your face, coming right at you. And for some of the prehistoric animals, for like in-house artists that they had gotten, the perspectives were way, way off. I think these are some bizarre-looking restorations. But Louis Ray had done some of the dinosaurs for that card series, and in kind of his own words, like he had to kind of show the staff how to do proportions correctly. And sure enough, his is some of the best art in that entire series, I think. Even for like a children's card game of animals battling each other, he still puts his rigorous approach to paleo art, and I really admire that.
Oh yeah, like he was another one of my favorite paleo artists growing up, and which is quite interesting because I mentioned how I liked the fact that Michael Skrepnik's work was not so much in your face, and yet Louis Ray's work very much is. But it's a really distinct flavor of like in your faceness, like you both kind of touched on. It both sparks the imagination that like these animals could have looked pretty weird, and certainly we know that a lot of living animals look pretty wild and crazy, right? So it's not like these are out of the realm of plausibility necessarily, and it's combined with very rigorous kind of anatomical and perspective work, despite like the so-called gaudiness. And so I think that definitely really stood out. And of course, like how ahead of the time he was, like definitely he was sort of one of the first paleo artists to be popularizing the idea of feathered non-bird dinosaurs. Like you said, the color schemes, like the very distinctive color schemes with a lot of detail to them. Certainly, like I would say, like, even to this day, I still think of a lot of the species he illustrated in the colors that he illustrated them in, just because they left such a strong impression. And finally, I think it's kind of similar to what I was saying about Michael Skrepnik's work, is that Louis Ray's black and white artwork, even though he's known for his like really colorful restorations, is really good as well. Like he did quite a lot of black and white sketches for a book called A Field Guide to Dinosaurs, not to be confused with the Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs, which is by Gregory Paul, but A Field Guide to Dinosaurs published in the early 2000s, written by Henry G. and illustrated by Louis Ray, had a lot of black and white sketches in them, and those look really good as well. So yes, definitely a very influential artist for me personally.
Yeah, I would also like to add about life appearance is that I also have mental images stuck in my brain of some fossil animals that are directly influenced by Louis Ray. For example, I still have a mental image of Deinonychus with this vulturine head, thanks to Louis Ray's illustrations. I also like to imagine that some of Louis Ray's in-your-faceness is because he wants to put you directly into the scene of the action where the animals are doing something, which is really good, and really fun, and if you think about it. Speaking of in-your-face action, we're going to talk about another 90s star who is especially well known for in-your-face action, named Todd Marshall. Todd Marshall's paleo art has always evoked this kind of in-your-faciness and this kind of awesome, bro. Oh my goodness, look at how awesome these animals are approach. Or as I would like to call it, heavy metal cover dinosaurs. But I really like these art pieces. They have this grittiness to them, this kind of signature look that nobody else could really accomplish except Todd partial. The heavy metal album cover dinosaurs really do sell well, and it fits with this 90s, early 2000s vibe. There's just a lot to like about the actions and the poses and the amount of detail and character he puts into these animals. Moving on from the 90s to the 2000s, we'll start with a rather obscure name, Nobu Tamura, who is sometimes referred to as the resident paleoartist of Wikipedia, which he definitely was for a time, because there is an astounding amount of work by Nobu Tamura on Wikipedia depicting all kinds of fossil animals. He specializes in these more obscure animals that tend to not have that many reconstructions to start with, so over the years, he's amassed this enormous portfolio, which he's doing in his spare time because he works as a nuclear physicist. He's a very admirable person, even though some people will say that his artwork isn't the highest quality. But in this particular the fact that he's doing this at all for free, volunteering on Wikipedia, is extremely admirable. And a lot of people have picked up the slack since then. And like Dmitry Boganov, for example, and in modern times we have people like Triloboy who are really doing a lot of illustration work for Wikipedia now that Nobu Tamura isn't as active as he used to. But hats off to you, Nobu Tamura. You have done just an impeccable amount of work. Now, another paleoartist, right, from the early 2000s is John Conway, who is best known, I think, for kickstarting the All Yesterdays movement, which we'll briefly cover in a second. But John Conway is an interesting oddity. He is effectively a modern artist who absolutely is doing paleoart above all else. And you can see that because his works are often these highly innovative, interesting, and strange. He likes to take a novel approach to things. He likes tweaking things. He likes making all his works pop, and he uses elements of composition and lighting and shadow and color really effectively. He sometimes makes the animal blend in with the environment. Sometimes he looks at the rules of composition and then says, what if I don't use these anymore? And she makes an uncomposition of a paleoart piece. And a lot of his paleoart works really have this really intriguing quality to them. You just want to take a closer look and look at the intricacy. And all the while he's doing all this bizarre, intricate, and innovative, artsy stuff, he's strictly adhering to accuracy. Even though his works can be highly speculative, there's always this core of scientific research in his artworks, be they as weird as they might. And his two favorite subjects, at least as far as I'm aware, are sauropods and pterosaurs, and he's been kind of pioneering in both of them. He achieves that in a lot of his paleoart work. It's not only on sauropods and pterosaurs, but on a lot of other animals, which is really admirable, in my opinion. Now, moving on to Julius Chitney, who is one of my personal favorite paleoartists. In fact, my first proper book on paleoart was The Art of Julius Chitney, which was just a collection of his artworks, which I absolutely fell in love with. He really has a diverse approach to paleoart. He can make all kinds of images. He can make simple portraits. He can make really massive, almost overly complicated murals that are partially done by photo bashing. His pieces done by photo bashing are sometimes a bit strange or off-putting looking, but I digress. But I especially like that he can work with a really wide diversity of subjects, from the Paleozoic to the Cenozoic, from large deep ocean fishes and sharks to elephants to feathered dinosaurs. What Chitney is especially good at is showing ideas of scientists in his paleo art. On the right here is actually an artwork Chitney did for a project my faculty at Helsinki actually worked on, which was on the ecological diversity of elephants during the entirety of the Cenozoic, and it's an artwork titled "The Kaiju of Turkana," which amazing title, and it's showing this incredible diversity of elephants. In fact, during the late Pleistocene, early Pliocene, there were at least 5 elephant species found in this one area in Kenya called the Turkana Basin, and you can see all of these together drinking from a waterhole with some early hominins in the foreground, but in shadow, because they are literally shadowed by these massive proboscidea and titans that used to dominate the landscape of not only Africa, but of Eurasia and North America, and even South America until the late Pleistocene. And it's just showing the magnificence of all these elephants. And yeah, he's good at showing scientific ideas in action. It's one of the best aspects of Julius Chitney. Do you have anything to add about Julius Chitney?
Well, he's probably one of my favorites. He's incredibly prolific. I understand he has illustrated 2 books now, where he has essentially drawn most of the known dinosaurs and a huge selection of fossil mammals. And I most appreciate, and of course this is looking back a couple of years now, when the Jurassic World website was up and running, when that first of the new trilogy was coming out, sort of had the online website to Jurassic World, where they were profiling the animals that were on display. They got him along to illustrate some of the other dinosaurs that were not featured in the final film. And you could just tell immediately the contrast between the designs that were used in the film, these sort of rather drab-looking animals, and just the life and personality of the dinosaurs that he had illustrated for the website. It was like night and day. I really appreciate his approach to capturing the feel of the animals, while also just creating really wonderful environments. And I understand that he's been doing a lot to get good, proper paleo art out into public spaces, especially in terms of like book publishing. If I remember correctly, I have seen an announcement that Princeton was making a field guide to Mesozoic plants. Julius Chetney was part of the team behind that book. I haven't seen anything as far as previews yet, but I'm very curious to see how he'll contribute to that.
Now, moving on from the prolific Julius Chitney, we'll move on to an artist who is a bit more obscure, Carl Buell. And Carl Buell is an interesting figure in paleoart history because he was extremely prolific for a time, especially in the early 2000s when it came to illustrating fossil mammals. He was most prolific with fossil cetaceans. He was very good with showcasing his knowledge of anatomy of the mammals, and his work was very rigorous and well researched, and it's absolutely stunning in general. Unfortunately, Carl Buell, prolific though he was, has essentially disappeared from the face of the earth. I have never seen new work from him. He is not on social media. His website doesn't function anymore. And it's a shame that he's so obscure and disappeared, essentially, because really more people should know him. But now you do. Moving on from the early 2000s, we move to the 2010s, which is an interesting era of paleoart because during the 2010s, something known as the All Yesterdays movement happened, which was a period of paleoart where the norm was to illustrate fossil animals in the style of the book All Yesterdays, which meant highly speculative behavior and soft tissue and anatomy, animals doing unexpected things, and just acknowledging that extinct animals were as weird and wonderful as modern animals are, which was not the norm in paleoart until then. And the impact of All Yesterdays can still be felt today, and it's probably one of the most innovative pieces of paleoart literature ever made. And artists of the 2010s really embraced the idea of All Yesterdays. 3 of these are shown here. On the left, we see here this really bizarre piece of artwork by C.M. Kozemen, who is a Turkish paleoartist and surreal artist, and just an absolute mad lad in general. We love him for that. He is amazing. This artwork depicts a massive spondylus walking about in late Triassic, early Jurassic South Africa. But behind it is a weird stone object, which C.M. Kozemen describes as the remains of a lost civilization that existed during the Permian, and that had ultimately caused the Great Mass Extinction. A lot of C.M. Kozemen's paleo artwork is really weird that way, and he himself would admit that his work is highly speculative, but it also makes his art very interesting to look at. There's always a really neat idea behind everything he does. C.M. Kozemen has a YouTube channel where you can enjoy his insights into his artwork and his eccentricity. let's say. Again, the man's an absolute mad lad. We love him. And his artwork reflects that. It's weird, it's wonderful, and it makes you think. On the right, we see 2 pieces of marine reptiles. The upper one is made by absolutely prolific and highly skilled paleoartist Joshua Knuppe, who is the host of the popular Paleo Stream that happens on Twitch every weekend, which is, I think, one of the biggest paleoart things that happen on Twitch, and he's really popular for a reason. He's a very creative and expressive artist. He has this deep sense of recognizing the weird and wonderful of the past and showing it and communicating it in his works. His works seem to be based on weird and unexpected observations people make of modern animals, and arguably prehistoric animals had such happenings too. Joshua Knuppe's work is also extra cool in the fact that he has done an absolute motherload of artwork. He does about 4 drawings each paleo stream, and which means that he's done hundreds upon hundreds of paintings over the years he's been streaming, which has just improved his skills as a paleoartist further. Below Joshua Knuppe's work of a pliosaur, we have a mosasaur done by the paleoartist Brian Eng, who is interesting. He's a very interesting figure who does very interesting and often highly speculative artwork, even though a lot of his art is heavily scientifically informed by both the literature and his own experiences in the field. His animals are often adorned with bizarre features of soft tissue, really bright colors. They are performing strange behaviors, things you wouldn't expect them to do, and his work is highly detailed. Moving on to more paleoartists of the 2010s, we have Velizar Semyonovsky and Mark Whitten. Mark Whitten, whose work you can see on the right of the 2 pterosaurs, is extremely prolific, and he essentially wrote the book on paleoart for the modern reader. The Paleoartist Handbook, I think, was the title, which is basically saying all the essentials for making pieces of paleoart, which is just amazing. He's one of the few paleoartists who has actually communicated it with the public about his process, about his ideas and research that he's done, about the intricacies of his paleoart pieces, which is amazing. A lot of paleoartists don't do that, which makes Mark Whitten even more special as someone who actively he talks about his process, and his work has gotten more and more grand as his skills have improved over time. On the left, we see a piece of art by Velizar Semyonovsky. Velizar Semyonovsky is not particularly well known outside of his field on fossil mammals. He's actually kind of obscure. But when you look at his artworks, you see this deep sense of realism and just life in his work. And all of his work have this majestic, atmospheric feel to them. He doesn't just do grand pieces, he also does the scenes of great action, and which can fill you with wondrous awe or even dread in some cases. For example, he did a piece where, if I remember correctly, a cat is up a tree, and a bunch of Kubanacaris, which is a huge pig with like a unicorn horn on its forehead, are rooting up the tree to bring it down, and it fills me with absolute dread just looking at the poor cat, and who's about to be torn to shreds by these pigs. What I also like about Semyonovsky is that he has done a lot of portrait work for more obscure fossil animals, like he did horned armadillos and rafting monkeys, illustrations for that book. Do you two have any notes on the artists we featured in the 2010s?
Well, I can certainly say that Mark Whitten is up there as among my favorites, for sure. Frequently, when I'm asked by friends for like a good introduction into paleontology and the history of the Earth, one of the books that I recommend is Life Through the Ages 2. Was an inspired project from Charles Knight's original Life Through the Ages from the 40s, which of course has been, in Mark Whitten's approach, heavily expanded to include organisms of all varieties across the entire history of the Earth, with special attention given to groups that often get the short end of the stick when it comes to these sorts of treatments. It's not just dinosaurs and big mammals. You're looking at the insect faunas, the flowering plants, the small mammals, that sort of thing. And I really appreciate the way that he is able to give atmosphere to his pieces in ways that they feel almost like a blend of nature photography and like classic painting from like maybe the 1900s. Really enjoy his approach for sure. And of course, the All Yesterdays movement itself, I mean, what it has inspired and produced since that time is nothing short of amazing. I had always wanted to see dinosaurs and other fossil animals as animals, and I really think that we are finally getting more and more of that opportunity with the All Yesterdays movement and beyond, simply for its approach of taking animal behaviors, even ones that we can't really find out in the fossil record, and applying them to extinct forms in a way that is believable. I just really appreciate what it has done for paleoart as a whole. What about you, buddy?
Yeah, all of these are definitely familiar names to me, and there's certainly a lot I could say about this whole movement because, like both of you, I was there to see it, and I saw firsthand how influential it was, but I think I'll try to keep this pretty brief. I mean, there are only a couple of things I really want to add, and one is that C.M. Kozman was one of the founders of the All Yesterday movement, and not simply inspired by it. Like, he was one of the authors and artists of the book, and honestly, like, some of the stuff in the book is less wild than the other stuff he comes up with. It's pretty funny. And Mark Whitten, yeah, I definitely knew of Mark's work even before the All Yesterdays movement. I remember his very early work in the 2000s, not just 2010s, when he was posting them on Flickr. And even then, of course, he has noticeably improved over time. But even then, I was really struck by how he was able to portray these animals not only in a scientifically informed way, but also showing them in ways that you might not have considered before, like pterosaurs chasing after their prey on foot, for example, is like that's something you don't see every day. And yet, at least given the evidence at the time, like he was able to come up with informed explanations as to why he depicted certain animals the way that he did. We're definitely living in very exciting times for paleoart, with all of these artists still active and kind of letting their imaginations and kind of scientific knowledge run wild.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And speaking of that, we are moving on from the 2010s to the decade this is being recorded in, which is the 2020s, now characterized by a growing feel of naturalism in paleoart, where people are taking cues from past wildlife art, modern wildlife photography, the old yesterdays movement, and the greatness of past paleoart, and combining it together to make these extremely impeccably lifelike reconstructions of animals that truly feel living. For example, we have Julian Pender Hume on the left, depicting a Mauritius blue pigeon, which is now extinct. Now, Julian Pender Hume is not a particularly well-known paleoartist, but I absolutely love his work depicting birds, because he's one of the few people actively doing reconstruction work of Holocene extinctions. We also have Emiliano Trocco in the middle with, I'm going to say, a very pleased Estemenosuchus. He's very excited for his new hat. And what I really like about their artwork is that sense of realism. There's a really deep sense of realism, as well as realistic animal anatomy, behavior, as well as just moodiness and atmosphere and great color schemes that combine together into these artworks that feel like old-timey paleoart, but they're made today by this one person from Italy. And he's depicting wildlife as wildlife, even though this wildlife was extinct up to millions of years ago. I would also like to mention Rudolf Hima, who's a very recent addition to the paleoartist roster, but he has taken everything by storm by producing artworks that make you go, oh my goodness. Because he can produce this stunning effect of atmosphere, mood, and grandeur in each goddamn piece of art he makes. And he likes these grand pieces with great atmosphere and really interesting color schemes, and just blending in the animal as a part of the whole picture, which is really wonderful. I absolutely love the way he draws. Of course, there are a few more I'd like to mention. For example, we have Gabriel Ugueto, who featured by his gorgeous Dinocyrus. And what I really like about Gabriel Ugueto's work is the amount of intricacy that goes in every reconstruction. He can do almost any fossil vertebrate you can think of. He's done dinosaurs and mammals and therapsids and fish and marine reptiles and lizards. In fact, Gabriel Ugueto was trained as a herpetologist, if I remember correctly. And you can tell because he draws such intricate scale work on each reptile that he makes. He's extremely prolific. He is essentially the paleoartist of the 2020s. On the right, we have Brendan Stockermans, who is especially prolific in dinosaurs and Cenozoic artwork. And what strikes me about Brendan Stockermans is his impeccable use of color. He is also a very good illustrator of modern bird life. Now, below Brendan Stockerman's work is a Sarcastodon, which is a kind of Middle Eocene in quote-unquote creodont, which was done by Flavia Strani, who is an Italian paleoartist, and she is relatively obscure, at least compared to Gabriel Ugueto and Brendan Stockermans, but I really like her artwork because it's stylized but in a very subtle way that brings in a lot of sleekness, a lot of personality and life to his illustrations, and it all really works. It's really lovely. Now, there's a few more modern paleo artists left to mention. We have Andrei Atuchin on the left, Giulio Lacerda in the middle, and Beth Zeiken on the right. Andrei Atuchin is a Russian paleo artist, best known for his depictions of dinosaurs of many kinds and many shapes, but he's also done work on marine reptiles and mammals and Permian animals and so on. And what I like especially is the attention to detail he has. He does really great texture work as well. On the middle, again, we have Giulio Lacerda, who is one of my absolute favorite paleo artists. And the reason for that is that he can make these absolutely beautiful paintings with great lighting, great use of color, and something that just feels alive in this unexplainable way that you could just reach into the artwork and look inside. Beth Zeiken, on the other hand, she's done really great mural work for multiple American natural history museums. She actually works in the Blue Rhino Company, who does these grand models of all kinds of natural history subjects. When you look at her murals, it doesn't feel like you're watching a mural. It feels like you're watching a panoramic view of a window straight into the Pleistocene. Now, do you have any notes on the paleo artists of the 2010s that we featured?
Well, certainly this is just the tip of the iceberg for what seems, in my opinion, to be a huge proliferation of brand new, well, relatively brand new paleo artists that have been out there. And I'm really grateful that even nowadays, paleo art is alive and well and with a lot more breadth and vigor than it has ever had. And I'm certainly looking forward to the continuation of these artists' work and whoever new might be coming around the block, because you can never really know, huh?
Yeah, I don't think I could put it much better than that. The only thing I'll add is that many of these artists have been around for quite a while. Like they're definitely not all of these artists are like, let's say, up and comers. It is quite remarkable, like just the amount of skill and talent on display, and it's all like accessible to us. Like a lot of these artists are very active on social media and constantly post their whatever they're working on or have recently worked on there, and so it is really amazing the kind of proliferation of skill and creativity that has occurred in this sphere, and I'm sure we'll see many more to come.
Yeah, what this decade really has showed us is that paleo art is more diverse and alive and prolific than ever before, and presumably it'll only grow in all of those things from now on, if just looking at the diversity of artwork by all of these artists is anything to go by. But from the history of paleo art, we can now move on to something similar, but just a bit different. What we're going to do now for this last stretch of this episode is to look at the history of paleomedia from the perspective of paleo art, because in my view, you can look at the history of paleo art from the lens of the way fossil animals were showcased in visual popular media, those being films, television, documentaries, and so on. Now, starting this brief overview of the history of paleomedia, we have something that technically is contemporary paleomedia, but really is not in a way. The antediluvian short film created by the prolific and highly skilled paleo artist Mario Lanza has now... The reason why I'm dubbing this quote-unquote 1800s paleomedia is because filmmaking and such, they did not exist at the time the first fossil reptiles were uncovered in Europe. But they did create a lot of artwork that feels otherworldly. As the word antediluvian feels to say, it feels otherworldly, ancient, mysterious, and the 1800s paleoart vibe is perfectly encapsulated and shown in a grand way in this short film by Mario Lanzas. I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't yet seen it, and we'll probably provide a link into the description. Do you have anything to say about this short film?
Oh, I thought that this was just delightful. I really liked the paleoart of Mario Lanzas to begin with. So to see that he had gone ahead and basically done a project like this with so many homages to not just classic paleo art, but like classic woodcuts too from just art history in general in Europe. I thought it was just delightful.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you haven't seen this short film, pause the video, watch this short film. It's on YouTube for free, and then come back. You won't regret it. Now, moving on from the 1800s, we can move on to the actual beginning of paleomedia, which is effectively early history of modern animation, which is really just wonderful. From Gertie the Dinosaur, or by Winsor McCase, we can actually see Gertie here on the left dancing. Also, the grand monster films, The Lost World from 1925 and King Kong from, I believe, 1933, which featured dinosaurs heavily, and they were done by stop motion from Willis O'Brien. Now, Gertie the Dinosaur is a cartoon. It's a very cartoonish cartoon of a sauropod dinosaur, even kind of for the time when it was made, but it's absolutely delightful. It's also one of the first pieces of frame-by-frame hand-drawn animation, which is really cool when you think about it. This one guy doing all of these drawings, frame by frame, by hand, with the background and everything. It's really cool. Now, The Lost World and King Kong were worked on by a stop-motion animator, Willis O'Brien, who was a mentor to stop-motion animator Ray Harryhausen, whose work is extremely well known. In fact, Harryhausen is one of the greats of stop-motion animation, as was Willis O'Brien. Now, Willis O'Brien was innovative in his work because he was effectively showing dinosaurs on the big screen for the first time ever. And for the time, it's really impressive. The dinosaurs are moving, they're trundling along in herds. You can even see them breathe.
I definitely want to draw attention to Gertie for just a little bit, because I remember listening to the interview with John Favreau for the Tetrapod Zoology podcast. He had made a very interesting point about the history of media in general in regards to dinosaurs and fossil animals, and that it seems that whenever a new medium emerges, one of the first things that people want to do with it, whether it be traditional methods like with Gertie, CG, stop motion, whatever, is to create dinosaurs and make them move. And honestly, looking at the history of paleomedia, that really does seem to be the case a lot of the times. Even in terms of like early stop motion, one of the things that artists love to do is stuff with like cavemen and with dinosaurs. Those were very popular approaches. And so with something like Gertie, what's really fun is, I mean, obviously the whole history behind the short, we don't really have the time to get into it now. But just the way that the animal's personality was directly inspired from modern wildlife, if you really think about it. I mean, Gertie is essentially a performing elephant. It's been turned into a dinosaur. But there's such a familiarity with the way that we see elephants moving that's applied to Gertie that just makes her so believable, even in this very cartoony state. And so I give her lots of respect.
I'd also like to mention the fact that during the time when these were made, these weren't old things. Large sauropod dinosaurs were a relatively new discovery back in the day when Winsor McCay he made Gertie the dinosaur. In fact, during the time when Winsor McCay was making Gertie the dinosaur, this was the first time that we actually saw these great mounds of Brontosaurus and Diplodocus in American Natural History museums. And the same can be said for the Lost World, because as there isn't that big of a time gap between the Lost World and the discovery of Tyrannosaurus Rex. From the moment people saw these animals, these grand beasts of old, they wanted to see them move and as living, breathing animals, which is really saying something about the impact of both paleoart and paleomedia as a whole. Now, let's move forward in time just about a decade into the 40s to look at a piece of media that should, in my opinion, be considered true paleoart, which is the Rite of Spring sequence from Disney's Fantasia, which is, in many ways, absolutely beautiful. For those unfamiliar, Fantasia is a Disney film with a bunch of sequences set to pieces of music. Rite of Spring is the longest of these, and it's set to the piece of music, The Rite of Spring, by, I think, Stravinsky. The sequence showcases the history of life. Anatomically, the animals shown in the sequence are essentially as accurate they could be for the time, that being the 1940s, and the attention to detail being shown here is amazing. It feels natural. It doesn't feel overly dramatized, and there's just a great sense of both peace and grandeur in a lot of the sequence as you're just seeing things happen. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, well, I mean, Fantasia is one of my favorite animated films, if not one of my favorite films of all time. And I could certainly go on for hours and hours and hours about just the production of the Rite of Spring sequence. But I certainly agree with you that, as far as like paleoart history and media is concerned, this sequence needs to get a lot more attention because it really was the brainchild of the leading authorities in the United States, with the top animators and artists in animation history at the time, combining to create essentially a portfolio of what was known about paleontology in the late 1930s to early 1940s. And I think it's just remarkable. And of course, the artistic choices and the musical approach standing in its own right.
I actually have a question to ask. Joan, wasn't there a scrapped part of this sequence where they were supposed to feature Ice Age animals?
Yes. So the Rite of Spring music for the film is heavily abridged and edited. There was an entire sequence that was planned featuring the Cenozoic and incorporating early hominins, at least up until, probably Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens, where they celebrate a hunt. But it was cut for two main reasons. One was just the length of the sequence was just getting longer and longer, and the film was already over 2 hours in length, and they really needed to trim it for time for something that was so new as this. And also was the fact that creationist uproar in the United States was rather prevalent at the time. And it was one thing to show the evolution of, reptiles in a sequence like this, but to connect evolution with human beings was still seen as very controversial in 1940. So they just wanted to play it safe because, a film like this was already a gamble to begin with, and they didn't want to blow their shot before people could really appreciate it. To date, there hasn't really been any emergence of concept art for that sequence, except for one development piece showing a group of Smilodons, or maybe Macaridus, with mammoths, kind of like a hunting sequence that was up for auction, one of the online animation auction sites. But that's it. Nobody's really seen anything else.
From the Rite of Spring, let's take a major leap forward about 40 years into the 80s, where we have this very intriguing purgatory between the classic view of dinosaurs into the dynamic and active super animals in which the dinosaurs of Renaissance depicted them as. And two examples I'd like to show here are the cartoon series Dino Riders, which in true 80s fashion is a glorified toy commercial, and the Don Bluth classic animated film The Land Before Time. Now, what I mean by it being a mix of these, well, let's start with The Land Before Time. Littlefoot's species, the longnecks, are classic brontosauruses, probably directly inspired by the mount of a brontosaurus in the American Museum of Natural History at the time. They are grand, lumbering hulks of animals that spend a lot of time in a swamp eating water plants in true Charles Knightian fashion. And they almost seem to drag their tails a lot of the time. But they move in herds. They live active lives. They care for their young. They look after their eggs. They migrate long distances. And this is especially notable in the sharptooth, which stands upright in the grand posture of the Tyrannosaurus in the American Museum of Natural History. But again, it's hyperactive, and it's this combination of the old views and new ideas at the time. As for Dino Riders, a lot of the toy is produced for the line are these classic animals in classic poses. At the same time, there is a Deinonychus in the toy line, which is directly influenced by Robert Backer's reconstruction. And there's also this Struthiomimus. You might notice that the tail is drooping and the arms are pronated and all that, but look at the texture. Looks a bit like fur, doesn't it? Yes, this toy dinosaur from the 80s has feathers for reasons I cannot comprehend for my life. And feathers back in the 80s were a very radical idea when it came to dinosaurs. So you can see that at the 80s was this combination of old and new in a fun way. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I think it's interesting to consider that there were little hints of that in traditional paleo art too, where even like prior to Greg Paul, you had some artists who were illustrating some of the smaller bipedal dinosaurs with rudimentary filaments, almost like, patches of hair, if you will, as if, anticipating what we would now know about integument of non-avian dinosaurs. As far as The Land Before Time is concerned, I mean, besides just a, genuinely great animated film, it really is one of those interesting amalgamations of old and new. Obviously inspired by classic paleo art, but also incorporating some of the new discoveries, as shown in the way that some of the animals are portrayed and move about. It is interesting to consider that at the time, this was relatively like cutting edge as far as animated dinosaurs are concerned, and had things not progressed the way that they would, as I'm sure you'll allude to very soon, this would have been like the image of movie dinosaurs for the time. There's a lot to think about, I think. What do you think, Albert?
Well, I have to mention this, and that is the fact that these things were not only happening in the English-speaking world, because the first Doraemon movie came out around this time as well, within this era, and that film features the main characters traveling to the Cretaceous period, and therefore encountering non-bird dinosaurs. And you see similar parallels in the depiction of dinosaurs in that first Doraemon movie. The general posture and aesthetic of the dinosaurs is, by our modern standards, like relatively old school, but they're also not depicted as being totally sluggish either. They are relatively active and get into some pretty intense fights and such. So you can see like this shift in paleo art happening in animated media all over the world during this era.
Exactly, which makes this particular era of paleomedia very interesting. But moving on from the 80s, a decade forward into the 90s, we have this absolute masterpiece by stop-motion animator Phil Tippett, that being Prehistoric Beast. Prehistoric Beast was its own short film, and this short film effectively is a prelude to Jurassic Park. What you see in the short film is the dinosaur renaissance view of dinosaurs on the big screen proper for the first time. And this almost directly put it into Jurassic Park, where Phil Tippett was supposed to do the initial creature effects until they moved on to CGI, but Phil Tippett was still very familiar with dinosaurs, so he was kept in the crew as essentially a supervisor for a lot of the animators, which led to his credit in Jurassic Park as the dinosaur wrangler, which has been memed to oblivion. But there is a reason why Phil Tippett was put into Jurassic Park, and it's that his animation of dinosaurs is remarkably lifelike and realistic, and just combine that with the camera work that he does and the composition. And I honestly think he doesn't get enough credit for that, and because it's, I think, absolutely remarkable. Do you have anything to add?
Well, if you want like more of our intricate thoughts about this sequence, we actually had reviewed both Prehistoric Beast and the accompanying sequences for Dinosaur in one of our earlier episodes that we had done for the show, and we'll link that in the description. But no, definitely, Phil Tippett, gosh, his approach to not just the look of the animals, but the animation style, I think I could accurately say is the pinnacle of dinosaur stop motion. This is some of the best stuff that was ever done, and I think it holds up in a lot of ways, even today.
Yeah, what Joan said. Go back. I think about 4 episodes ago, and we talk all about it there.
Moving on from Phil Tippett to paleodocumentaries in the 80s and 90s, these are a genuinely interesting thing to witness, because these were done in the days before CGI was good for anything in the grand scheme of things. A lot of these feature still images and 2D animation, with only brief glimpses of 3D animation in the cases of Velvet Claw and Paleoworld. Briefly on this series, Paleoworld is an episodic series which features one topic at a time on a wide variety of subjects, a bit like Eons, but on television. And they feature Paleoart, they talk to scientists, and they have this calming narration and music. It's really good. The Velvet Claw isn't quote-unquote paleomedia per se, because rather than focusing just on an extinct group of animals, it focuses on the evolutionary history of the carnivora. It features a lot of 2D animation of fossil animals reconstructed and moving about, and also images of fossils, as well as explaining some paleobiological aspects of fossil carnivorous mammals. I would also like to give a special shout-out to Lost World's Vanished Lives, narrated by none other than David Attenborough. And it's a brief series on all kinds of fossil finds. There's talk on dinosaurs and Lagerstätten and identifying fossils and the history of fossil discovery. It's a very different look to us who grew up with everything that came after this. And looking at it, these kinds of pieces of paleodocumentary are actually very good. I highly recommend that you watch through these. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, I quite enjoy the documentaries of this period too. I think they're honestly something that I genuinely miss as an essence in documentary television. What's particularly fun about Paleoworld is that often the approach to showing the animals as they lived was to take like still images, paleo artwork, and just kind of pan across them, showing the animals, and of course with sound effects and the right kind of music to kind of liven it up a little bit. But that's something that you don't really see anymore, in the age of CG. It's kind of charming in a way.
Yeah. You see that in YouTube now, not on television. How about you, Albert?
Yeah, Paleo World I've heard of, but I've only seen a handful of episodes. But I've seen enough to get the general vibe. However, Velvet Claw, I've probably mentioned it on the show. In fact, I think I mentioned it in the same episode where we talked about Prehistoric Beast. The Velvet Claw is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. I really wish like more modern documentaries would take some cues from its format and its style of presentation. It's that good, in my opinion. You're right, like the documentaries of this period do have like an essence to them that I think is missing quite often these days. They definitely have a very distinctive charm to them.
Yeah, I agree. Now, it is true that television executive and directors probably won't make anything like this ever again. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is that they are cowards, and two is what happened in 1999 with the release of a certain series that marked a point of no return. That being the Walking With series, that began with the release of Walking With Dinosaurs in 1999. The series and the whole trilogy afterwards began, well, as a project essentially of Tim Hayes to present these fossil animals as living, breathing animals, living things in the style of a modern nature documentary, like a David Attenborough special, but with dinosaurs or mammoths. And the making of this could be an episode on its own. There is a lot to say about the intricacies and the artwork and the production history of making this trilogy, but the impact this left is also with the general public. In fact, nowadays, most people expect this kind of vibe from paleodocumentaries. Now, I should mention that I do absolutely love these three series, despite their flaws, and my personal opinion is that the best of them, my favorite, is Walking with Beasts. We still feel their impact, be good or bad. Anything to add?
So there's certainly a lot that I could say. It's kind of a funny thing. I just kind of noticed that the cover art for Walking with Beasts and Walking with Monsters are basically the same.
Maybe it's the same family line that both started out as Dimetrodons, but now one's an Entelodon and one's a Hyenodon, and they're still arguing.
Right. I certainly have a lot of nostalgia for, especially the original Walking with Dinosaurs series. I was around when it premiered in the United States, and for the longest time I had the DVD and would watch it religiously. It is really fascinating to see how it holds up today. I recently celebrated the dinosaur bicentennial by rewatching a bunch of dinosaur media from my childhood, and that included all of Walking with Dinosaurs. And not for nothing else, it certainly has aged, I think, the least in terms of the subject material and even some of the animals themselves. The quality of the CG has definitely dropped significantly over time. I think it's fair in saying that sort of thing. Even like within the Walking With trilogy itself, watching this on my friend's enormous flat screen television that was like 50 or 60 inches, yeah, Walking with Pixels, more like it. But I appreciate the storytelling approach and the way that all of these series weaved around the life of one animal while still giving you a sense of the world and the way that it's changed throughout each successive episode. And I think that in and of itself is what makes the series for me so special.
After these, you had When Dinosaurs Were in America, which was in production at the same time as Walking with Dinosaurs, but then you had something like Dinosaur Planet, which was directly inspired by Walking with Dinosaurs. Not to like dunk on the series, I absolutely love it, but it did mark a point of no return for paleomedia, I think. And moving on to beyond the series to the 2000s and 2010s, we can still see the impact of Walking with Dinosaurs. This era is exemplified, I think, by three things. One would be those documentary specials people did, where they have this grand IMAX theater thing, and it doing all kinds of discoveries and things, and a lot of CGI animals going about out the place. But also those Discovery Channel, National Geographic documentaries where they show the scientists and the discoveries and the bones, but it's interspersed with a lot of animation, as well as these shorter form series that vary wildly in quality, from decent to bad to truly terrible, and Dinosaur Evolution. Now, Prehistoric Predators is an example of those National Geographic Discovery Channel specials. It's kind of the sister series to the infamous Monsters Resurrected, also known as Mega Beasts. But unlike that series, Prehistoric Predators is actually pretty good. It focuses on a bunch of Cenozoic macropredatory animals. Nothing special, but I really like how it's not overly violent or excessive in its editing, like, let's say, Monsters Resurrected it is. So it's pretty good, in my opinion. In the middle is Dinosaur Evolution, which is good, actually. It's a very unique approach to dinosaur documentaries that many people didn't exactly appreciate at the time of its release in 2011. Dinosaur Revolution is interesting in that it's essentially a love child of David Krentz, which we just mentioned a couple dozen minutes ago. And looking at it, it's really bringing modern thinking of dinosaurs to the modern audience. And just like many productions David Krentz has been in, unfortunately, that are about dinosaurs, it went through absolute production hell. So it's a miracle that we even have the series to begin with. Technically, Dinosaur Evolution is all yesterday's The Show. It predates All Yesterdays by about a year, but being All Yesterdays, The Show kind of makes sense because All Yesterdays didn't just spring out from nothing. It was a growing feeling within the Paleoart community at the time that something needed to change in the way we portray prehistoric animals. And when you look at Dinosaur Evolution for what it is, essentially, which is a bunch of semi-cartoonish vignettes of dinosaurs going about their business, I really like the storytelling aspects, the character design aspect, just everything visual that David Krentz and his crew has put to the table. So it's really good. Now, as for IMAX feature documentaries, I want to mention Sea Monsters because, in my opinion, it's probably one of the best paleo documentaries ever made because it hits all the right boxes. It's showcasing a lot of animals going about their business in a deeply naturalistic way. It's also showing the scientists and the discoveries that was the inspiration for these animals. Not to mention, the animation is actually really good. There's a very beautiful soundtrack. There's this really clear story arc. And as far as accuracy goes, it has aged remarkably well. So, combining with all these features, it's one of the best ever made. At least in my opinion. Viewers at home can disagree with this, as might my co-hosts. Do you have anything to say?
I think this was definitely a really interesting time period in paleo documentaries because you could tell that everybody was kind of thirsting for more in the wake of the Walking With series, and that caused some very good stuff to come out, but also a lot of very not so great things. It was interesting. I think out of these, I remember Dinosaur Revolution the most. It has a bit of an inherently silly kind of style. Like, a lot of the storytelling is meant to be very humorous and cartoonish. But, like, at the time, you're right, like, this was the cutting edge, essentially. Like, they worked closely with paleontologists to get the animals looking accurately according to the latest science at the time. They were showing a lot of, like, novel behaviors that people usually weren't showing these animals doing, and showcasing some very obscure creatures and some newly discovered ones at the time, too. So I definitely do have a fondness for that one.
Moving on from the 2010s into the decade we are now, the 2020s, we are seeing a different kind of approach to paleomedia, where we take the influence of Walking With Dinosaurs and people start to make something new out of it, with series such as Prehistoric Planet, which is amazing in every possible way, and Life on Our Planet, which is actually pretty good, but heavily over-criticized in the community. But Prehistoric Planet deserves special mention as essentially a lightning in the bottle situation, where you had Nature Geek director Jon Favreau working with both Apple TV Plus and the BBC Wildlife Unit, and then they go and hire Darren Naish as the lead creative consultant. However, making it a standard is a bit of a stretch because such opportunities are unfortunately very rare. Now, life on our planet is, again, quite good for what it is, but what separates life on our planet from Prehistoric Planet is that life on our planet had a much more conventional production and also a more traditional presentation. It's remarkably similar to a bunch of paleodocumentaries that were done in the 2000s and 2010s, but because Life on Our Planet was released after Prehistoric Planet, it was automatically compared to Prehistoric Planet, which is superior to Life on Our Planet, but Life on Our Planet still got a lot of things right. For example, one of these series is continuously referred as the birds as dinosaurs. The other is Prehistoric Planet. It should also be noted that Life on Our Planet marked the first paleodocumentary appearance for a lot of really wonderful fossil animals like Megacerops and Myocetus, which we haven't really seen in documentaries before. The main difference between these two is that Life on Our Planet was made with a general audience in mind, whereas Prehistoric Planet is made by paleo nerds for paleo nerds. And while there are differences, again, I think both are quite enjoyable. This is not to mention that there's also other kinds of great paleomedia, like the excellent series Dinosauria by Dead Sound, also known as David Armsby, who is currently making a second season of the series for his YouTube channel. What do you think, Albert?
Oh, I definitely agree. I mean, we covered the Dinosauria series as it came out on the show, and we've also talked briefly about Prehistoric Planet and Life on Our Planet before, and for most part, I think we said some very good things about them. I definitely can't say enough good things about Prehistoric Planet. It's just absolutely amazing, like you said, and I think if people want to find out more about what I think about it, I wrote a couple of reviews on my blog where I go into more detail. Life on Our Planet I've only seen part of. I still haven't finished the series, but from what I saw, I agree. It's fairly well done, and it's a pretty nicely presented documentary for the general audience.
I'll just briefly add that wherein Walking with Dinosaurs was the big inspiration and a starting point for a lot of people's paleo interest and obsession, as well as the inspiration for all the paleo art. I feel that Prehistoric Planet will have that same role. Now, we can move on to a little teaser, because on the next episode, we will be moving from paleoart history into research. We'll be looking at how to do effective research, because navigating the huge mazes of books and research articles and scientific journals can be difficult if you don't have the proper ways to navigate it. Before we go, I actually have a question to the viewers, which you can answer either in the comments or in the Time and Clade's email address, which is there a paleo artist or piece of paleomedia that you like or you appreciate that we didn't mention? It'll be great to hear your thoughts. And if you are interested, you can ask me questions about my work at Tumblr at tumblr.com/otussketching. I have anonymous questions open for the time being, so if you are keen, you can ask me questions on Tumblr even if you don't have an account. You can also follow me on Blue Sky at pelican-man.bluesky.social.
Right, so those of you who have made it all the way to the end here might have noticed that Joan kind of disappeared at the end, and that's because she had internet connectivity issues. So I will do the closing this time. We do have a Patreon account for this show. You can give us monetary support if you like. Some of our Patreons are on a tier where we are required to give them shout-outs in every episode, and these include Joan's sister Julie, Tristan, Frankish, and Val Denunzio. So thank you very much for your support. And hopefully we will see more of you there, especially if you like to see us make more of this series. We have a number of people to thank for this episode. Our friend Emily composed the theme music for our show, and the color scheme for my Alvarez or Avatar, which you can see here, was designed by my friend Alicia.
I'd like to thank Emily and Denver, as well as my colleagues Ville Sinkkonen and Maija Karala, for helping me out with making this series. Thank you.
So if you want to follow what the show is up to, you can follow us on Twitter. Yeah, we still have an account on there for some reason, but we will post about any new video releases. But you are most likely watching us on our YouTube channel through Time and Clades, in which case you can give us a follow if you like our content and haven't already. And if you have any questions at all, you can leave us a comment in the comment section below or send them to our email address at timeandclades@gmail.com. And we will leave links to various things we discussed in the video description below, so check those out if you want to find out more. And with that, I think that's the end of the show for now. Thank you for sticking with us and hope you enjoy this new and exciting series about Paleoart.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.